When did Australian artillery fire its first shot in anger?
This is the Principles of War podcast, professional military education for junior officers and senior NCOs.
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to episode 64 of the Principles of War podcast. In action, Australian artillery in the Boer War and the first shot of the First World War. This is part of our special commemorative series looking at 150 years of Australian artillery. The last episode looked at the birth of artillery in Australia, the initial units that provided defence to the nation, our first deployment to the Sudan. Now we turn our focus to the guns in the Boer War. The Boer War started on the 11th of October, 1899. It was to last for 2.5 years. The British Empire deployed 450,000 troops. 16,175 were from Australia, which makes up about 3.6% of the personnel deployed. Overall, more than 100,000 became casualties. Australian casualties were 251 killed in action, 257 died of wounds, and 1,400 wounded. Now, at the time, the Australian population was just 3.6 million, which means that 0.42% of the Australian population served in the Boer War. 50% of our population was aged between 15 and 44, and assuming that 50% of those were males, that brings the percentage up of deployed forces to 1.7% of those who were eligible to deploy. But that's around 1 in 58 males in Australia served in the Boer War, which really puts it in context, the number of people who served and the percentage of those who made up the population. Now, of course, we don't want to forget the 60 women who deployed to the Boer War, and they all served as nurses. At one stage, Australian mounted troops made up 50% of the total mounted troops that were available to Lord Roberts. The British employed 84 batteries of artillery, 50 independent sections, pom-poms and galloping maxims, and 4 militia garrison artillery companies. Australia deployed just A Battery, with 5 officers, 174 ORs, and their 15-pounder breech-loaded guns, and 6 of their 15-pounder breech-loading guns. They were usually split into 2 gun sections. Their deployment lasted 18 months, and they were the only permanent Australian Army unit to be deployed, although when they arrived, they weren't actually a part of the Australian Army because that didn't come into being until the 1st of March 1901. They were the only field battery that was sent from Australia to South Africa. The official history states that in point of personnel, it was probably, and in point of discipline, it was certainly the most highly classed detail that left Australia for the war. On the declaration of war, the New South Wales government immediately offered A Battery, but only its commander, Captain Horace Dangar, was required, and he was sent as a special service officer going in the first contingent. Recruits were called for in anticipation of a deployment, and in December the offer was accepted. A Battery was deployed and it arrived in Cape Town on the 5th of February 1900. Dangar at that point rejoined it after seeing action at Colesberg with the Royal Horse Artillery. On the 12th of February 1900, the battery got on a train for Belmont in Northern Cape Colony near the border of the Orange Free State. Colonel Sydenham Smith, who had taken over command of the battery after Dangar left, writes what happened after they arrived in Belmont. We heard with regret that Lord Roberts' column had started from Modder River and other points to relieve Kimberley and recognised that we were about 10 days too late to be included in the force. The same night, I got orders to send 2 guns to Honey Nest Kloof and 2 guns to Enslin. This was due to a report that an attack was likely to be made on the lines of communication between Belmont and the Modder River. The gunners had been relegated to protecting the lines of communication, which frustrated them. Driver William Wiseman wrote, "We thought we were coming to South Africa to fight, but if they keep us like they are doing, we will not see a shot fired, let alone in action." The The gunners often served as mounted infantry, although even that action was fairly unsatisfying. Colonel Smith would later write, "From what we hear, there appears to be little chance of getting out of this part for some time, though things are quiet now all south of the Orange River. The North is still in rebellion, and we may cross the river to suppress it there, but they will come in as soon as we appear and we shall get no fighting. They, the Boers, can't stand guns or Australians. No kudos to be got out of this sort of thing, but I'm trying to keep cheerful, knowing that although an unpleasant duty, still it is a necessary one." The battery continued to be spread out, and in September 1900, the right section was ordered to Vryburg, which is about 200 kilometres north of Kimberley, and that made the battery's frontage over 400 kilometres. It was at Vryburg that the right section was to see its first major action, and David Horner describes what happens in his book, The Gunners. In November, fire from the right section's guns at Vryburg helped beat off a Boer attack on the garrison. A few days later, a mounted patrol, including Anthill and one gun, came under strong attack. They were rescued by a party of Imperial Bushmen, accompanied by the second gun from Vryburg. Between 7 a.m. and 7 p.m, the number 2 gun fired 190 rounds, and gunner Bernard Gowing was mortally wounded in the action. Ubique, translated from Latin, means everywhere, and that was granted as a motto to the Royal Artillery and Royal Engineers by King William IV in 1832, and in 1833 it was granted as a battle honour for the Royal Artillery. It was granted to them in place of all former and later battle honours that they could receive, signifying the ubiquitous contribution that the Royal Artillery has played in the conduct of British battles. For the Royal Australian Artillery, Ubique is the battle honour, and the motto is Quo fas et gloria ducum, which translates to where right and glory lead. In January 1901, the left section would be involved in a significant action against the Boer general Christian de Wet. Now, de Wet was a renowned commando famous for his ability to escape the clutches of the British who were desperately trying to capture him. He was so famous that he was mentioned in Rudyard Kipling's Ubique poem, the poem about the Royal Artillery and their service in the Boer War. David Horner takes up the story in his book. De Wet, with a large Boer commando, entered the Cape Colony in the hope of causing an uprising among the substantial Boer population there. This provided an opportunity for a major action by Australian artillery. In crossing the railway north of Houtkraal, De Wet's column was attacked by Crabb's British column moving north. On the 15th of February, under fire from the left section's guns, De Wet's commandos fled west, leaving his baggage, 40 wagons, a Maxim gun and 30 prisoners. Crabb's column set off in pursuit and was soon joined by a larger British force, including Australians, under Brigadier General Plumer. De Wet obtained some fresh horses, but before long, Plumer's horses were spent, some dropping dead under their riders. In chilling rain and hail, Crabb and another Imperial column under Henniker headed across country, hoping to cut the Boers off. Cubis, in his history of A Bty, continues the story. Their columns were exhausted, the men tired, sick, starving and ragged, and the horses foundered. But excitement restored their spirits. The left section, almost alone of the British guns to keep up, hurried into action and in short time brought the Boers under fire. Under their accurate fire, the Victorian mounted rifles deployed and charged the ridge. At first it seemed that De Wet would stand and fight it out, but Christian's section speedily silenced the enemy artillery, and while the Victorians pressed on in fine style, the Boers broke. The Christian that he mentions there is Lieutenant Christian, the section commander of the left section. Horner continues, the following evening, the Australian guns were again in action, causing the Boers to abandon a Maxim and a 15-pounder, the only guns for which they had ammunition. De Wet recalled later that it cut me to the heart to give up my guns. De Wet made his escape, but had been prevented from penetrating into the Cape Colony. Cubis wrote that of the half-dozen or so sections of artillery with the leading British columns, Christian's section was the only one to keep up at the finish. Lieutenant Christian was a very capable officer and led the section until March 1901 when he fell ill. At that point, he was replaced by a Royal Artillery officer who greatly improved the dress sense of the battery, but apparently was well regarded despite this. The centre and right sections joined a column commanded by Lieutenant Colonel Remington. They were based at Standerton, which is southeast of Johannesburg, and the column took part in operations in the southeastern Transvaal. Remington was particularly pleased with his guns, often watching the fighting from the gun line and shouting, "Pour it into the bastards." He was adventurous in his use of the guns, and one of his officers wrote that the 15-pounders were invaluable in keeping the Boers at a respectful distance. It is rather satisfactory to plump some shrapnel to a group of waiting, watching Boers 3 miles off, who are just concocting in their sinful hearts some scheme for getting a shot at you. The side that has no guns at this game is apt to look rather silly. In early August 1901, the left section was sent to Standerton to concentrate with the battery there prior to returning to Australia. Colonel Williams, in whose column they had been serving, wrote to the battery commander about the performance of the section, and he wrote that it had been a pattern of smartness and efficiency. They have trekked many hundreds of miles with the column, and I never wished for better artillery. Remington wrote, "The excellent horse management and accurate shooting of the RAA have contributed very largely to the success achieved by the column during the last 2 months, and I shall be very sorry to lose their service." The commander of Remington's artillery wrote that Australia may well be proud of such a fine battery. On the 20th of August, A Battery sailed from Cape Town and arrived back in Sydney on the 15th of September. During their deployment of over 18 months, the battery had lost 1 man killed in action and 2 from illness. Over 40 men had been invalided home through illness, and 3 years later, in November 1904, A Battery was presented with the King's Colour, which was later renamed as the King's Banner, in recognition of its service in the Boer War. A Battery deployed with the 15-pounder breech-loading gun. It's worthwhile having a look at this gun. For that, I'm going to use Major General Steve Gower's Guns of the Regiment book. He writes, "In 1897, New South Wales changed its long-standing but unfulfilled order for 12-pounder guns to the newly developed 15-pounder breech-loading gun. The 15-pounder had been developed from the 12-pounder 700-weight gun by modifying its sights and firing arrangements to enable a heavier 15-pound nominal projectile to be fired. Otherwise, there had not been much difference between them. However, when placed in the context of overall gun development, the 15-pounder attracts much more significance as being representative of the last of an era. Succeeding guns were to have a proper recoil system and shields to protect the detachments, and they were to dispense with the axle tree seats upon which 2 of the detachment could ride into action. The order was for 6 guns, and these, Mark I's, on which had been termed a special New South Wales carriage, were delivered in 1898 to become the equipment of A Battery New South Wales Artillery. The 15-pounder had a calibre of 3-inch or 76.2mm. It had a range of 5,490 metres and a muzzle velocity of 482 metres per second. It played a significant role in the Second Boer War. 349 guns in total were deployed by the Commonwealth. 349 guns in total were deployed by Empire forces, and they fired 166,548 shells out of the British total of 233,714. So over half of the shells were fired by the 15-pounder. Despite having a range of 5.5 kilometres, the number 56 time and percussion fuse, which was used in the shrapnel round, could only had a maximum timed range of 2/3 that, and because it only burned for 13 seconds. The shrapnel shells in use were usually time set to burst in the air above and in front of the enemy. The Boer War would highlight some of the lessons for the employment of artillery, particularly as the capabilities and weapons were changing that were on the battlefield. Many of these lessons would be reinforced by the Russo-Japanese War. Horner describes these changes. Until the Boer War, the practice had been to sight guns in the open and fire over open sights, and in skirmishes carried out by the Australian gunners this proved sufficient. Nevertheless, since the 15-pounder guns had no gun shield and only a relatively short range, the most essential requirements of a well-trained battery was to get its guns into action quickly, engage effectively, and, if necessary, move quickly out of action, close up to the target, to compensate for the short range and quickly re-engage. However, in larger battles, this technique proved unsatisfactory. In the early stages of the war, the Boers had superior guns and could outshoot the British. Furthermore, their expert riflemen firing from concealed positions could pick off the exposed British gunners. As a result, the British purchased improved 15-pounder quick-firing guns from Germany and developed techniques for firing from concealed positions in the indirect mode. This involved the use of the improvised attachment in place of the old foresight, which was called the gunner's arc. The gun was laid behind the crest of a hill, and an observer on the crest, where he could see both the enemy and the guns, gave corrections by degrees, either left or right of the original line of fire. For the Royal Artillery and the Royal Australian Artillery, the Boer War was the last major engagement prior to the First World War, and therefore it's really important to understand the thinking that went about from the lessons learnt from the Boer War and how that impacted the doctrine, particularly because Australian artillery doctrine was drawn from the Royal Artillery doctrine. Amongst all of the European armies, there was significant discussion about where the guns should be sighted and how they should be employed. These questions, along with the role that they should play, i.e. how much of it should be used in suppressing enemy artillery as opposed to directly supporting the infantry, were key questions. And for some of the thinking on that, we'll turn to Major General Bailey's Field Artillery and Firepower. And he writes, British military opinion turned decisively against firing from cover and indirect fire, a concept with which it had never been at ease. The evidence from Omdurman seemed to confirm that of 1870, the weight of fire rather than protection was the key to success. The other evidence of 1870, that guns in the open would suffer severely, seemed less compelling 30 years on. On the eve of the Second Boer War, British views on large-scale warfare had altered little over the decades. Colonel Henderson, for example, believed that the Peninsular War of 1808-13 offered better lessons than the Franco-Prussian War regarding the use of the bayonet. The Second Boer War taught some sharp lessons and spurred significant developments in artillery tactics, some of them doctrinally regressive. The British almost always enjoyed a numerical superiority over Boer artillery, and they employed their guns in accordance with the traditional practice, firing shells that were fused to detonate at a maximum range of just 3,000 metres. They deployed in the open, firing directly and usually ineffectively at the Boers, who were usually well concealed in accordance with new German thinking. Boer frontages were unprecedentedly wide and often overlapped British frontal assaults. The attacker faced the novelty of an apparently empty battlefield, men no longer advancing against a massive visible enemy, but against an invisible one, creating the fear that he was everywhere and probably in great strength. There was the psychological terror of being enveloped by the enemy rather than merely facing those immediately to the front. The Boers were able to generate a high rate of rifle fire from concealed positions and inflicted heavy casualties on the exposed British. At Colenso, British guns presented themselves to the Boers in open positions and had to withdraw with great loss, unable to hit back. The Boers had few guns, but they were of a more modern design than the British pieces. The Boers were equipped with the Maxim Nordenfeldt field gun and 155mm Creusot pieces. At Magersfontein, in 1899, the Boers deployed 5,000 men along 11,000 metres, and at Colenso, 4,500 men along 13,000 metres. Despite the width of these positions, they were not penetrated. The British were frequently unable to locate and silence well-hidden Boer guns or to suppress their infantry before launching costly assaults. However, even though the Boers had modern quick-firing guns, dispersed deployments and lack of experience usually prevented these guns from inflicting catastrophic losses. There were occasions when Boer quick-firing guns were able to match a larger number of older British guns. On the 5th of February 1900 at Brakefontein, 3 Boer 75mm guns shelled 36 British guns for many hours, with the British outranged and unable to reply. The Boers had some heavy artillery that proved painfully effectively, and as a result, by 1906, each division of the British Army had a heavy battery of 4 60-pounders and 30% of its ammunition was HE. Had the British managed to synchronise their artillery bombardments and infantry assaults better, the Boer guns would have had either to reveal their positions to British guns or to abandon their infantry to be overrun. It was only towards the end of the war that this synchronisation improved. British failures were thus essentially ones of target acquisition and all-arms coordination. British artillery learned the need to disperse in the face of superior firepower and to conceal itself. If enemy artillery was inferior, guns should concentrate to fire into the sector to be assaulted. Counter-battery fire would be carried out only to silence the guns that threatened the attacking infantry, and it was seen to be futile to attempt to win an artillery duel when the location of the enemy's artillery was probably unknown. While the value of indirect fire was recognised and measures taken to facilitate it, the likelihood of it being accomplished successfully in mobile operations against unidentified targets was regarded as slim. It was this perception that most influenced doctrinal developments over the next decade and encouraged the adoption of the disastrous practices prescribed in the artillery doctrine of most armies in 1914. The experience of the Boer War had been a searing one. Instead of acquiring howitzers, the British Army bought longer-range guns, but if anything had less intention of firing them indirectly than it had before the Boer War. An increase in range was welcome, but it brought little substantial change. Because fire was generally to be direct, in almost all cases, there would still have to be conducted at short range from exposed positions. There was a consensus in European armies that this would be successful in the face of lethal defensive fire only if it was overwhelming and was coordinated with the infantry assault. Such assaults would require immense tenacity. In 1903, Colonel Ferdinand Foch claimed that in the attack eventually there is, so to speak, an impassable zone. No deflated way to access are left. A hail of bullets sweep the ground. To run away or fall on, such is the unavoidable dilemma. To fall on, but in numbers and masses therein lies salvation. Almost metaphysical beliefs in the offensive spirit led European armies to regard high morale rather than artillery as the primary means by which infantry could redress the physical effects of defensive firepower. A constant offensive mentality preempted a more balanced approach to the complicated technological human conundrum. More logically, in 1903, Major BFS Baden-Powell expressed a minority view that the Boer War had shown the dominance of the defence and that this should be its primary lesson. Baden-Powell believed that machine guns would make certain zones practically impassable and that long lines of defences would be virtually unturnable. In a prophetic vein, he advocated the introduction of armoured cars and movable forts. I've quoted from Bailey quite extensively there because I think it is really important that we get an understanding of the doctrinal setup for Australian artillery and for European Army artillery in general. Following the Boer War, we've got the Russo-Japanese War, and many of these lessons are borne out, however misinterpreted. So a significant opportunity to rewrite doctrine in the face of changing technology is missed because the lessons learned aren't correctly analysed. The Boer War, however, did provide significant opportunities for operational experience for some key players in the Australian Army. Major William Throsby Bridges served as a Special Service Officer. He was posted to a British cavalry division and took part in the relief of Kimberley and the battles of Paardeberg and Dryfontein. Another artillery officer, a young Lieutenant Cyril Brudnell-White of the Queensland Regiment A Bty, saw minor operations in 2002 with the 1st Battalion Australian Commonwealth Horse. He was to be the Chief of Staff for the Australian Corps under General Birdwood in the First World War, and later Chief of the General Staff of the Australian Army. I'll finish off our discussion with the Boer War with the closing paragraph from Horner in his book. The Boer War therefore provided the officers and men of the RAA with valuable experience in the handling of men in operations and in deployment of small subunits, but they learned little about the higher level command of artillery or about the techniques of massed artillery support, primarily because the British had little opportunity to employ their artillery in this role. The British artillery had yet to develop the techniques for employing guns in the modern battlefield. When the Australian field artillery was employed in the First World War, its expertise would depend more on what its officers had learned during the previous dozen years of peacetime training than on what lessons they had learned on the high veld of South Africa in 1900 and 1901. So prior to the outbreak of the First World War, we have the development of the artillery capability within Australia with a mix of full-time, militia and volunteer members, some of the equipment being provided by civilians, 2 operational deployments, one to the Sudan and one to South Africa for the Boer War, close links with the Royal Artillery in Great Britain, and the development of the School of Artillery for the training of officers and NCOs in artillery skills. This all leads us to 1914. In particular, a meeting between the Australian Prime Minister, Joseph Cook, and his senior army officers in Melbourne in the late morning of Sunday, the 2nd of August, 1914. Cook has just received various warnings from London about the imminent outbreak of war. Orders are issued to the gunners of the Royal Australian Garrison Artillery and the Permanent Engineers, and the defended ports of Fremantle, Albany, Adelaide, Hobart, Melbourne, Sydney, Newcastle, Brisbane, and Thursday Island are all to be manned. David Horner describes what happened next. On the afternoon of the 2nd of August, Captain Morton Williams, Royal Australian Garrison Artillery, and his wife were enjoying afternoon tea at Queenscliff when he was ordered by Lieutenant Colonel Augustus Sanford, commanding the coast defences of Port Phillip Heads, to proceed immediately to his war station and take all action for the precautionary stage of mobilisation. Within an hour, Williams was at his war station as commander of the examination battery at Fort Nepean. One garrison gunner describes the actions. The subterranean magazines and shell stores were unlocked, supplies of ammunition conveyed to the gun pits, ammunition lifts, gun sights, electric firing apparatus, rangefinders, telephones, alarm gongs, signalling gear, and the 101 technical appurtenances which go to make up the Coast Defence Catalogue were tested and brought to use. Rifle ammunition was also issued to the artillerymen who manned other strategic locations, as there were no permanent infantrymen for the task. At 7:45am on the 5th of August, the German cargo ship SS Pfalz steamed out of Port Melbourne and headed slowly down Port Phillip Bay. By about 10am, the ship had reached Portsea, where it was boarded by an officer of the examination service in the launch Alvina. The Pfalz's paper were in order and it was permitted to proceed. The ship had just got underway when Lieutenant Colonel Sanford at Queenscliff received orders by telephone that he was to stop the ship. Already at Fort Nepean, the lookout had noticed a large column of smoke and flame, the ship evidently stoking in a remarkable manner to increase speed. The duty of the examination battery was to control the movement of merchant shipping through Port Phillip Heads in conjunction with the examination vessel. Now that war precautions were enforced, the battery commander was empowered, without reference to any other authority, to fire a shot across the bows of any offending merchant vessel. On this occasion, Williams received orders from Sanford and acted immediately. The B-gun detachment was ordered to take station, load their 6-inch Mark 7 gun with a full charge of cordite and a 100-pound projectile, and stand by to fire the heave-to round. With his gun ready, shortly after midday, Williams ordered the signal "Stop instantly" to be hoisted on the signal staff of the fort. The ship's pilot, Captain M. Robertson, failed to see the signal, and the Pfalz continued on her course towards the Heads. The roar of the 6-inch gun at close range and the scream of the shell as it crossed its bow at such an angle that it struck sea astern and to the starboard quarter drew Robinson's attention to the signal flying at Fort Nepean. Meanwhile, Williams had ordered another round to be loaded and the detachment stood by to fire at the ship. However, this was not to prove necessary. On the bridge of the Fowles, there was a short struggle between Robinson and the ship's master, Captain Kuniken, before the ship turned around and steamed back to Portsea. The examination battery kept a gun laid on her until she returned to Melbourne that night in the charge of the naval boarding party. With a change of name, the Fowles was used by the Australian authorities for the remainder of the war. This was the first round fired by the British Empire in the First World War. With this, we will conclude Serial 1 of our special RAA series. The next episode is going to look at the Battle of Bullecourt, where there are significant lessons that we can learn for the employment of artillery. Specifically, we're going to look at the First Battle of Bullecourt. This occurred in 1917, and so what I will do is I'll make reference to a significant number of podcasts that have been done by the Royal Australian Artillery Historical Company in their Firepower Seminar series, which looked at the 4 years of Australian artillery employment during the First World War. There is a wide range of speakers bringing their experience and knowledge of the employment of artillery during the First World War to the podcast series. And so I would draw your attention to those. Please have a listen to them. There are some really amazing stories and lessons learnt from the First World War in that series.
The Principles of War podcast is brought to you by James Ealing. The show notes for the Principles of War podcast are available at www.theprinciplesofwar.com for maps, photos and other information that didn't make it into the podcast. Follow us on Facebook or tweet us at Surprise Podcast. If you've enjoyed this podcast, please leave a review on iTunes and tag a mate in on one of our episodes. All opinions expressed by individuals are those of those individuals and not of any organisation.